Good morning and welcome to the University of West Indies and the Caribbean Center for Educational Planning. This is our second webinar being hosted here at the School of Education at the UWI. The theme for today's webinar, Reimagining Education, Pre- and Post-COVID Considerations. Before we get started, I'm inviting Mr. Miguel Ison, Assistant Lecturer in the School of Education and a member of the CCEP operations team, to bring us the welcome and the general introductions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thompson. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to the Caribbean Center for Educational Planning, CCEP, second webinar. I am Miguel Ison, as you've already heard, and on behalf of the CCEP, I would like to thank you all for gracing us with your presence. Those of you who are online or those of you who are physically present. At this point, I would like to recognize a few of our special guests. First of all, the Most Honorable Sir Kenneth Hall, who is Chairman of the CCEP Advisory Board and former Pro Vice Chancellor and Principal at the Mona campus, UWI. Also, I'd like to recognize online Professor Fernandez Ramirez, who is our keynote speaker for today. As you heard a little while earlier from Dr. Thompson, today's webinar is being conducted under the theme, Reimagining Education, Pre- and Post-COVID Consideration. Ladies and gentlemen, you are in for a treat, as we have Prof. Ramirez, who is here with us, and he will share some of his thoughts on the educational deficits. We'll see what some countries are currently doing, and we'll examine the way forward. I would like you to sit back, not to relax too much, but do enjoy today's presentation, including submitting your questions online for a discussion session, and we also will have reflections from a few of the CCEP members. So once again, welcome to the second webinar, and thank you for gracing us with your presence.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ison. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about the CCEP. We have taken note of our members of our audience, including Professor Sir Kenneth Hall, who is chair of the CCP Advisory Board, as we were just advised, Professor Ramirez, our keynote speaker. Here in the room, we have members of the CCEP operations team and the support team for today's event. We want to welcome and acknowledge colleagues from other educational institutions, colleagues working various ministers of education across the region, as well as colleagues from the UWI. I'd like to remind you, those of you who might not be so minded, that the CCP was established in September 2016 as an entity designed to provide a mechanism for addressing the needs of the Caribbean region for improved educational planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation skills. The vision of the CCEP is to be an organization which enables countries in the Caribbean and Latin America to acquire sustainable capacities in educational planning, thereby resulting in a higher quality of life for our citizens. The Caribbean Center for Educational Planning has as its mission supporting regional development and improved productivity through the provision of high-quality services. Our core business includes competency-based training in strategic educational planning, developing and evaluating strategic educational plans for educational institutions and countries, research designed to inform new approaches to educational planning and policy, as well as thought leadership in the areas of educational planning and policy. Today's webinar falls under the fourth area of the CCEP's work, namely thought leadership in the areas of educational planning and policy. And we're grateful to you for your participation. We are confronted at the moment with a global pandemic which has challenged every country of the world. And for us here in the Caribbean, given what we may describe as comorbidities or pre-existing conditions in our education system, we are seeing a worsening of the challenges that we face. Today's conversation is designed to provide a foundation and make a contribution to some of the ways in which we can address the challenges we face. We're grateful to have among us Professor Sir Kenneth Hall, who will come in a minute to outline for us the objectives of today's webinar. But before I take my seat, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Mona Institute of Technology Services, MITS, and UII-TV for facilitating the broadcast of this event via YouTube and on UII-TV. It is our hope that today's conversation will provide support in laying out parameters whereby we might address the improvement challenges and the transformational expectations in our education system. I now invite Professor Kenneth Hall, Chair of the CCEP's Advisory Board, to come to the podium.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me say how pleased I am to be participating in this discussion this morning. Let me acknowledge all of you, but I hope you will allow me on a point of personal privilege to acknowledge my former minister, my former colleague and friend, Mrs. Henry Wilson, in a very special way. As I explained to Dr. Thompson at some point, the reason we are still here when I was principal is that we used to have a regular breakfast meeting to discuss all the issues of education and UWI in particular. So it is really good to be here again this morning. Now, most of us have been discussing globalization and the disruptive impact it would have had on our economies, on our lives, on the way we do things. But I think even in our wildest dreams, few of us imagine the disruption of COVID-19, and that because of globalization, COVID-19 could not have been limited to one country. We imagined, as we are doing now, that technology would have facilitated conversations across continent, across time zones, but few of us would have imagined that a particular virus could have had this focused attention. And it doesn't matter whether you wish to join the conversation, you're forced to do so. And this morning's webinar is intended to address some of the consequences of COVID-19, especially as it affects us in the Caribbean. In Jamaica and the rest of the Caribbean, and if I may say in developing countries, the challenges of the education system have been known for some time. The disparities that existed, the question of planning, setting objectives, the linking of education with development and other issues, or the absence of it in some cases, we are all aware of. But what we are now faced with COVID, is that these issues can no longer be ignored. Because if we ignore them, as we are already seeing in some countries, certainly in Jamaica, in 10 years or in 5 years, our education system will not be anything that we can identify from this perspective. Already, some of the impact of it is seen, and it is the inadequacies that are emerging. But one of the opportunities created by COVID is that we are now forced to change the way we do things. And it is in this context that CCEP will play a pivotal role, because this is now about radical changes, and it's not we do not have to initiate it, but we have to respond to it in creative ways. So today's seminar is the start of a conversation on the matter of change, and disruptive changes, if I may emphasize. And the issues to be discussed are intended to both stimulate further conversation and ultimately policy action, as well as to inform the parameters of such action. As I've said before, education systems in this region are faced, and have been faced with major challenges for decades. Indeed, those of us who have been involved in education have deplored the slow response we have had in the transformation for decades. The issue of sustainable development, we know, must become central to our education budgeting. But the question, for me at any rate, and I'm sure for many of us, what has not so far been at the center is that without a functioning education system linked to the social structure, linked to development in the broadest sense of it, our societies cannot absorb and cannot respond to the transformations and disruptions that we now face. And so it is part of that has brought us, part of that challenge that has brought us here this morning. Today's webinar then is aimed at pursuing 3 principal objectives. It will examine some of the key factors which shape the deficits in the education landscape of developing countries pre and post COVID-19. It will explore approaches being used by a sample of countries to overcome the challenges they face in delivering quality education. And we will have discussions about the lessons and insights so that Caribbean policymakers, practitioners, strategists, and other stakeholders may learn and implement in a way that will strengthen the response of Caribbean countries to COVID-19. Even if we did not have a Caribbean Center for Education Planning before COVID-19, I am sure we would have had to create one now. Fortunately, the foresight of the members of the university, and particularly Dr. Thompson, in anticipating the need for an institute, a center that could mobilize resources, could mobilize the academic community to influence policymakers in creative ways. Long before COVID, in a sense, 3 years before COVID really became so dominant in our thinking. And yet, this center, despite its earlier beginnings and its formative years, now has to play a leading role in this response. I therefore wish to commend the center for the role it has taken in supporting the planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation processes that we have in our education systems. What Dr. Thompson has just indicated was a new component of these operations. Rarely do we hear about thought as an action item. It's more reflection, but thought leadership has become such a central component of CCEP that we have to pay attention to that. And this webinar is an example of what thought leadership is about. I trust, therefore, that the conversation will lay the foundation for focused action and cooperation, because the CCEP stands as a ready and willing partner with Caribbean education systems. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hall, Chair of our CCEP Advisory Board. So as not to contaminate the counter, I'm standing at this distance with my mask on, and I'm going to be inviting Dr. Thuris Ferguson to come and introduce our guest speaker.
Good morning, everyone. I've been tasked with introducing our keynote speaker for this webinar. Professor Fernando M. Ramirez is the Ford Foundation Professor of Practice in International Education and Director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative and of the International Education Policy Master's Program at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Professor Ramirez studies and teaches about innovative education policies and programs that help students develop competencies necessary for civic participation, work, and life in the 21st century. He also works in the area of global citizenship education and in how to align education policies with the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. Further, he studies how education policy and leadership foster educational innovation and quality improvement. He is a member of the Massachusetts Board of Higher Education and a fellow of the International Academy of Education. He chairs the board of World Teach and serves on the boards of Facing History and Ourselves, Teach for All, and other educational organizations. As can be seen, Professor Ramirez is an expert in the field of global education. So please join me in welcoming him this morning.
Thank you so very much for that kind introduction. And thank you so much, Professor Canut, for this opportunity. Let me put in context how I came to be working on education in COVID. In February of this year, I was planning a visit to Mexico to launch a book which I had recently published. And as I was discussing those plans with a colleague in the School of Public Health, Professor Rifat Atun, an epidemiologist, he said, "I recommend that you cancel your visit to Mexico." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because this COVID situation is getting out of control and it will soon be declared a pandemic. And given that reality, our life as we know it is going to be upended, and travel of any sort is highly unadvisable for the next 18 to 24 months." So I proceeded to do exactly as my colleague had recommended. And the next thought that occurred to me was, how are we going to teach? We certainly have no experience. Most countries around the world, with the exception perhaps of Liberia, given the Ebola epidemic, had any experience with how to educate in a context in which students and faculty could not get together in the same physical spaces. So I reached out to colleagues in a number of international development institutions, and I said, I think we should be trying to generate some knowledge that offers some guidance to education leaders of all sorts, principals, administrators, ministers, about what to do if we don't want the next 2 years to cause the largest setback in educational opportunity in a century. And the person who responded right away was my good friend and colleague, Andrea Schleicher at the OECD. Within 30 minutes of receiving my email, we were on a phone call, and he said, "Well, what do you think we should do?" I said, "Well, let's first get a sense of what the needs are." And we sent a survey through our own respective institutional and professional networks to colleagues in about 100 countries, in which we asked them, what plans do you have to teach during this pandemic? What are the greatest risks? What support do you need? What knowledge would be useful for you to make decisions? And we processed that survey very quickly. And at the end of March, we were hosting virtual convenings of this sort around the world, with groups ranging from a few thousand to 5,000 people, where in the same convening you would have the Minister of Education, but you would also have teachers in rural schools, provided they had internet access, discussing what are we going to do. And that experience helped me realize two things. One, the necessity for informed dialogue. Informed dialogue is the title of a book I published more than 2 decades ago, in which I present a theory about how it is that educational research and planning can support democratic processes of decision-making, particularly in contexts that are rapidly changing. Now, at the time I wrote that book, I didn't really have a pandemic in mind. I basically had the kinds of rapid changes that are characterizing our world in mind. And so I became convinced that we needed more of those dialogues, and I'm delighted to see Professor Canut's and the center's leadership in this role of convening precisely this kind of informed dialogue to assist decision makers and educators more broadly in this context. But the second idea that occurred to me is that it was very important to learn from outliers, to learn from positive deviants, to learn from people who, against all odds, were actually managing to create alternative forms of education. So we began then a process of documenting those practices. And we have to date documented 30 case studies around the world of how it is that various educational institutions and governments, both city governments, state governments, national governments, have managed to create alternative educational arrangements to sustain educational opportunity. And we have similarly convened informed dialogues to discuss those findings. I have also taken stock of what do these case studies have in common? What is the shared DNA that documents what the emergence of those innovations has made possible, so that we can seize the innovation dividend generated by this pandemic. At the end of May, Andrea Schleicher and I administered another survey to basically take stock of what had happened during the previous 3 months. And to my surprise, the story is one of tremendous innovation around the world. I mean, set aside the obvious, that not every child is being served, that this pandemic is magnifying every possible known form of inequality, that it is accelerating all kinds of pre-existing challenges. But that we all know. We didn't need to do research to anticipate. People knew that in the first survey that we administered in mid-March. What I didn't know, and what I think most people did not know, is that this was going to be a context that was going to generate also remarkable levels of innovation. And I think it behooves us, as we continue to convene these informed dialogues, to try to learn from that innovation and to document that innovation dividend and figure out how do we direct it to the kinds of issues that Professor Kenneth has highlighted. How do we direct it to building an education renaissance in which we address pre-existing challenges that we knew predated the pandemic to make sure that we build back better? So it is in that context that I want to situate the remarks I'm going to make. And I'm, at this point, going to try to share my screen. If you would just give me a moment so that I can find my slides and do that to support the remaining of my presentation. So just bear with me for a minute as I do that. We all have had to retool ourselves into learning to use all these technologies to do simple things like giving a talk. Can you please confirm for me that you are able to see my screen at this point?
Yes, seeing you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So I think that building back better should be not about abandoning this framework that was adopted at the UN General Assembly 5 years ago, but about doubling down our efforts to advance these goals. And that might seem counterintuitive. How could we possibly be trying to build a better world in a context in which we're barely trying to stay alive and we see the number of deaths increase by the minute? In my own country, in the United States, by the time this pandemic is over, we would have lost more lives than the number of lives lost in every military combat by Americans in every military combat since and including World War II. And that has happened not only because of the result of the lethality of this virus, but because of very deficient leadership, in particular from our president, and because of a very poor judgment of considerable parts of the population, which is a very powerful and sobering message to educators. I'm sure that every educator in the United States is asking themselves today, what did we fail to teach our students that, or our former students, that they could be so easily captured by demagogues that tell them that wearing a mask is a political statement? And so in that context, how could we be thinking about building that better? But I want to argue that it is precisely in that context that we should be thinking about building that better, because the alternatives are so much worse. See, the alternatives, we just need to look back at the pandemic of 1918, which arrived in Germany the very same year the Weimar Republic arrived. And the impact of that pandemic was to accelerate an economic recession and depress municipal spending. And as a result of that, throw a lot of people to the margins of society. And of course, understandably, make them feel excluded. And that event, which is well documented in a recent paper by the Federal Reserve Board of New York, How Pandemics Radicalize People, along with the Treaty of Versailles, which basically made Germany pay for the entire reparations of World War I, caused the emergence of a lot of extremely intolerant groups. And a total unknown named Adolf Hitler had the patience of building a coalition among all those groups. And in 12 years, this total unknown became elected Chancellor of Germany. So you could argue that the pandemic of 1918 produced a breakdown of democracy in Germany and bring about the rise of fascism and of World War II. I'm not suggesting this pandemic is going to do this time around, but I am using that example to underscore how severe the risks are and how destabilizing the potential consequences of this pandemic are, even after the health impact is brought under control. It is for that reason that I think it is very helpful to have a North Star like the Sustainable Development Goals guiding our efforts in education to build back better. The UN, I think, Development Goals gives us another very clear North Star. Sustainable Development Goal 4 outlines a vision of what does it mean to educate people for a world that is inclusive, that is sustainable, where everyone belongs. It means to educate people for sustainable lifestyles, to advance human rights, gender equality, promote a culture of peace and nonviolence, to educate them as global citizens, and to help them appreciate cultural diversity and the contribution of culture to sustainable development. Of course, some of these ideas are not new. Some of these ideas are expressed in Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one of the most remarkable creations of human imagination, of human hopefulness, also produced at a time of great pain at the end of World War II. When looking back at all the devastation, all the pain, all the loss, all the death produced by this human-made violence, a group of visionary leaders had the audacity of imagining that a world that would be more stable and peaceful would have to be a world in which every person had some rights just because they were a human being. And that audacity of imagination that included, for example, education as a right, produced, in my view, the most significant silent revolution humanity has ever witnessed. See, in 1946, when this declaration was adopted, there were 2.5 billion humans on the planet, of which only 45% had ever set foot in a school. Today, with 7.8 billion humans, more than 95% of them have not just set foot in a school, but spent in them considerable periods of their lives. And this would not have happened. It's easy to dismiss the significance of that for those who have a lot of privilege and who maybe would have had those opportunities regardless. But for the many millions who gained that opportunity as a result of that act of imagination, of that act of human will and desire to build back better, it would not have been possible without that declaration. And I think our current moment is a comparable moment. Now, it would be easy to say COVID-19 has shattered all those hopes, has shattered our desire, our ability, our will to even hope to achieve the SDGs. COVID-19 has caused a huge hole in our capacity to dream big. One of the most recent issues of the journal Foreign Affairs summarizes this crisis very well. The authors are Carmen Reinhart and her husband, both professors at the Kennedy School of Government. Carmen is now the chief economist of the World Bank. And they basically put in black and white what this pandemic is going to mean. It's going to mean essentially a huge economic calamity. In my view, comparable, if not worst, to the debt crisis of the 1980s, which affected countries like Jamaica, and in fact, most countries in Latin America, as well as in sub-Saharan Africa, producing what was called the lost decade. What was the lost decade? The lost decade was the consequence of countries having to decide where to cut because they had to absorb a financial austerity. And of course, what they cut at that time was education and public health. So the Reinhardt say this crisis is going to produce multiple financial crises. Many countries will be unable to pay their debts. This will produce a contraction in economic activity because all economic engines have been shut down at the same time, a decline in global trade, increased unemployment, a disproportionate impact on the poor, an additional 60 million people pushed into extreme poverty. Since this article was published 3 months ago, that estimate has been revised by the World Bank. The most recent estimate is 120 million people thrown into extreme poverty. And that's a lot of families. And an increase in hunger and a very slow economic recovery. So this is the world that we're living in. Not much better than the world that Germans experienced after 1918. What are the mechanisms through which COVID-19 is going to impact education? There are at least 5 channels. Number one, this stringent, brutal austerity that will be faced by governments. Number 2, the austerity that individuals will face, the people who are out of work, the health impact on the lives lost, and also the mental health impact, the result of living under prolonged duress and stress. The interruption of schooling that has caused many children to not only not learn, but to disengage from school altogether. And the multiplier effects of this pandemic on other challenges. What are those other challenges that predated the pandemic? Educational challenges. The world was living through what many term an education crisis, a crisis of learning, a failure of an opportunity to learn things that were relevant. Inclusion challenges, challenges of competitiveness, challenges of social violence, both domestic and societal violence, challenges of democratic governance, and a climate change challenge. All these things were with us before the pandemic. These are all the things that the SDGs are trying to help us address. And the pandemic has worked as an accelerant thrown on all those challenges. Secretary General of the UN has, I think, adequately summed up this pandemic in these terms: much more than a health crisis, an economic, a humanitarian, a security, human rights crisis that has accepted individuals, families, and societies, and that has brought to the surface, highlighted the fragilities within and among nations. It is no exaggeration to suggest that responding to this is going to require reimagining society and the ways in which countries collaborate for the common good. Coming out of this crisis will require a whole of society, whole of government, whole of the world approach driven by compassion and by solidarity. So I want to share a few ideas as a way to set the stage for our conversation about what would it mean to build back better in education. What would it mean to align our education systems with this inclusive vision of the SDGs? First thing I think it's important is to recognize what are the silver linings of this pandemic. What are those dividends that we should capitalize on? And I want to mention 7. Number 1 is a much greater emphasis on the importance of educating the whole child, understanding that no child learns very much when they're in fear, when they're in stress, that a person is both intellect and emotion, mind and heart, and that we need to educate children holistically. I think that the pandemic has made this crystal clear, and I anticipate that coming out of this pandemic, this will be a goal. Much greater appreciation of the importance of science and technology and of human reason, the power of human reason to improve ourselves and our communities. Much greater appreciation of the importance of technology to help us do the kinds of things we're doing today. Much greater communication between schools and their homes. If there is one thing that this pandemic has done, is it has brought teachers and parents a lot closer together. And teachers now know a lot better than they did before who their students are and what their circumstances are, as well as parents know a lot better who the teachers of their students are and what they do. Much greater appreciation of society for education. I've been really struck, impressed, that education has been in many societies one of the top 3 priorities, following only in this pandemic the concern for health and for economic well-being. And that's something that did not happen in 1918. Much greater collaboration among teachers within schools and with others and with other stakeholders. My vision of informed dialogue presented in that book published 20 years ago, I think has been realized by this pandemic. The recognition that we all have to work together. I think that the center is basically stepping up to this challenge, understanding and wanting to be a convener of various stakeholders, understanding that the insights of the teachers are as important to the policymakers as the insight of the policymaker are to the teacher, understanding that the viewpoints of a parent are so critical to the educational planner as it is important for the parent to understand the mindset of the educational planner. And then finally, much greater reliance and recognition of the value of partnerships among civil society and government, business and public sector. When I look at all these innovations that I have been studying over the last several months, one of the things they have in common is the recognition that good ideas can come from anywhere. And it is the good leader, that the person, the one who creates a context that makes it possible for those collaborations to emerge. Let me take, for example, the city of Bogota, led by an extraordinary secretary, a woman named Edna Bonilla, a university professor herself. Very first thing that Secretary Bonilla did when the government said we're going to shut down schools is she convened a meeting on Zoom to which she invited teachers and principals. And she said, let me be clear. I do not know how we're going to sustain education during this pandemic. But I'm convinced we have to do that and that we can only do that together. So I'm asking for your help. It was a Winston Churchill moment of blood, sweat, and tears, of basically not lying to the people and recognizing, developing great humility, demonstrating great humility and vulnerability, and conveying, let's do this together. And it is for that reason that the city of Bogota was the very first place in Colombia that was able to build a multimedia platform that basically succeeded at sustaining opportunities and eventually became national strategy. Something very similar was done by the Secretary of State of Sao Paulo in education. He had previously been Secretary of Amazonas. If you know anything about Brazil, you know that Amazonas is one of the most marginalized places in Brazil. And what the Secretary did when this pandemic was declared is he convened a meeting of the main business leaders of Sao Paulo. And he did the same thing that Secretary Bonilla did. He said, I have no idea how to do this, but I need your help because our state cannot afford to let most children go without an education for the next 2 years. And they too built a multimedia platform, which of course they realized, they did it within a week. They had built a platform. Of course, it was imperfect. Of course, it served only to tell them what it couldn't do and then improve. Similarly, in Chile, 2 young people, members of this organization, Teach for Chile, part of a much bigger network called Teach for All. 2 young teachers in their 20s, when the government decided they were going to shut down the schools, they said, who's going to teach our students? And they had read that the members of Teach for Nigeria had the previous week used their mobile phones to record lessons and to distribute them to their students through WhatsApp. And so what they did is the same thing. And those lessons were done with a lot of humor. And within a week, everyone in that community was listening to these math and Spanish lessons. And the mayor got to hear about it. And so what he did is he shared that to a listserv with 250 mayors of very marginalized municipalities in Chile. And those mayors built partnerships with local community radio stations. Within 3 weeks, this innovation developed by 2 young teachers was serving the needs of students in 250 municipalities. I'm not saying by any means that any of these innovations is perfect, that it is serving every kid, but I'm saying that that's a lot better than the alternatives, which for many leaders have meant hiding under the table, under the mattress, hoping for the moment to pass, hoping for someone else to solve the problem. See, I think this pandemic has served as a magnifying glass, spotlighting the good leadership where it has been present, and also spotlighting the bad leadership, where it has also been present. And we've had abundance of both of them. So looking forward, I think the challenge is to basically support good leadership. And for that, I envision that the North Star of Building Back Better is going to include this emphasis on breadth of skills, on educating the whole child, on helping students develop a sense of purpose, helping them develop an ethical foundation, this foundation that builds a world with a lot more solidarity, that builds the kind of world that is implicit in the vision of the Sustainable Development Goals. that prepares the young for the unknown with the ambiguity, the capacity to deal with ambiguity, the flexibility, the capacity for adaptation that are essential for survival, that prepares them for deeper and continuous learning, for personalization, that has an education that is problem and project based, that realizes how important high quality curriculum and pedagogy are, that values teachers as professionals, that sees schools as organizations, and that builds much more connecting tissues between schools and outside schools. None of these ideas are new. I think they were there before. It's just that the current moment has heightened their importance. This recent book, which you can download as an open access resource, is all about how do we pay attention to the details of implementing that vision. This is a study of 5 systemic reforms around the world with great detail on how it is implemented. And I don't have time to discuss that book. I'll conclude basically presenting this other open education resource that can be downloaded on this link that offers an approach to transform entire schools, districts, and education systems to educate students as global citizens. Let me stop here because I realize we only have 10 minutes left, and I would like to have a bit of time for interaction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ramirez, for that comprehensive presentation. We believe that you have outlined some considerations that are worthy of further reflection, and we want to facilitate some of that just now. We have taken note of the comments, some of the comments being made in the chat. I'm going to invite the curator of that process, Ms. Montgomery, who is the administrator of the CCEP and playing the role of researcher live, to come and take us through this process.
Yes, sorry.
And Professor Canute, let me just say that I'm delighted to stay until 11, but I will have to leave promptly at 11 as I have another webinar following this one.
Understood. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues. Thank you for your questions being posted via YouTube. Encouraging persons to continue their posting. Professor Ramirez, one question. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for the insights that you have shared. Reflecting on the questions, I'd like to ask, what type of leadership may be expected from the academy and other sectors as we grapple with the tremendous fallout occasioned by this pandemic?
Thank you so very much for this question. I have just recently finished a study with colleagues in 20 different countries looking at how universities have actually connected with entire education systems to assist them in sustaining education opportunity. And somewhat to my surprise, I have seen that universities have stepped up to the moment of understanding that in this moment of great need, they have more privilege, they have more capacity than even the best endowed schools. And universities, this is the topic of this book, which is now under peer review by Springer, and which I hope will be published next year. It is a story of how, at this very difficult moment for humanity, universities understood that the task at hand was not just to figure out how to continue to do their business of research, of education, but how to be of service to society. And universities are doing just that, and they're doing that in many different ways, providing professional development to teachers, developing curriculum and innovative modalities, engaging their students and their faculty in supporting schools. And I think in that process, universities are not only serving their social mission, they are actually becoming more relevant. They are aligning the work of their faculty with things that matter. I'm sure that 50 years from now, when people look back at the current moment, I don't know if they will come to see it as an equally devastating moment as World War II. But there is no question that they will ask of each one of us, including academics, you knew that this was happening. What did you do in that moment? And I think that every academic should be able to say, we did everything within our power to be of service to society and even more. And what I have seen in my research is that many universities are doing just that.
Thank you, Professor. A colleague is asking, what is the proposed redress or intervention for social resilience at this point? How would you speak to that?
I don't think there is a single intervention. I think that what we need is to have, certainly to build networks that make collaboration among schools with other entities, let's say universities, possible, and to have them identify in this setting what is the most pressing needs. Now, in many places, and for, say, the most vulnerable populations, that is a need for social-emotional well-being. And what that means is prioritizing through whatever delivery strategy can be used. For some kids, that's WhatsApp. For others, it means radio, it means television, it means learning packet. Ways to help the students and their families take care of their well-being. That's step number one. Let me give you an example of what the opposite of that would mean. In one of these informed dialogues that I was convening in Chile, we had in the same meeting the Vice Minister of Education, and we had ordinary teachers and even some parents. And at that moment, the Ministry of Education had a real obsession with covering content. To them, this issue was about making sure that the pace of covering content in the curriculum was not interrupted. And it was either a teacher or a parent, I forget, or maybe both, who said, but Mr. Vice Minister, with all due respect, are you aware of the fact that we are the country with the highest levels of violence, domestic violence against women in this hemisphere? And that the stresses created by this pandemic have just augmented that reality. And you are making that problem worse by placing the burden on families of having the kids raised through the curriculum. Shouldn't this be a moment in which we rebalance what we're trying to do and address that need? And that's a very good example of how, in that context of great domestic violence against women, that should be the center. Now, that may be a different situation in Jamaica. Maybe you have other priorities at the moment. But I do think that what I can think of as a process to address that is not leave teachers alone. Not leave teachers alone in having to figure this out. Give teachers a community, both of peers and of others, perhaps in a university, that can help them. The reason I keep insisting on universities, there are 28,000 of them, more than 28,000 of them in the world. For the most part, they have a lot more resources, a lot more capacities than the best endowed school. If we could connect universities with networks of schools, I'm certain we could solve this problem to a great extent of giving the kids educational opportunities. We just need university leadership and faculty to understand, to take this challenge as their own.
Thank you, Professor. You alluded in your presentation to the need for innovation. One of the questions being posed is, would you reflect on the need for a proactive rather than a reactive response to the crisis?
Yes, I certainly think that we need to do more than try to cover the holes, but to figure out how do we build that better. But the question is, how do you get a system to do that? And I think it's, in general, much easier to move a system when you build on its strengths than when you ignore where the system is. That's part of what we tried to do when we began to develop those case studies. We basically said, what innovation is already present in the system, and how do we go beyond that to build something better? For example, I teach at Harvard a course on education policy. In fact, I just finished teaching it this semester. In my course this year, I engage all my students as consultants to governments around the world, working with at various levels, from districts in the United States to national governments in the case of Bangladesh. And these teams of students have been working with counterparts in governments for an entire semester, helping them put in place a strategy of educational continuity and a strategy for further resilience. I can tell you that most of those governments have been very appreciative of having teams of 4 or 5 people who have dedicated time and attention and talent to helping them put a strategy together. And in all cases, but one, I haven't finished reading all the papers, but I have worked pretty closely with the students. In all the cases, all of the recommendations are about, first of all, do the things that are within reach, do the things that are easy. And then from there, build a much more robust system. So let me give you, I was having a chat just before I came in with a team working in Bangladesh. So in Bangladesh, there are tons of things that are low-hanging fruit. If you take the strategy of the government, this team has been able to come up with a series of recommendations where the government said, okay, why don't you now help us implement it? This is terrific. We hadn't thought about that. Now we need further assistance executing it. And they're trying to figure out how to do that. So obviously the place to start is where the system is. And I think identifying those strengths, identifying those bright spots is the right way to animate a system. In my experience, no system changes very much if you come and basically tell those responsible for the system that the sky is falling on them and they're doing everything wrong. That doesn't move anybody. Systems are much more likely to move if you can show them the excellence that is already present within the system, and if you build from that towards something better.
Thank you, Professor. So you're saying start where you are. So two last questions as we wrap up this segment. A colleague is asking, how do we effectively deliver laboratory-based materials in a manner that still ensures that practical skills are developed within this context?
Yeah, that's a very challenging thing for the places where you cannot meet in place. So you think about technical education. You think about technical education that is teaching people trades that require the use of equipment. In a context where you cannot have access to equipment, how do you do it? Don't have a good answer for that. The only thing that I can offer is that even technical education nowadays involves thinking about a range of cross-sectional skills, 21st century skills, soft skills that need to be learned even by people who are learning trades. And those skills absolutely can be learned in an online context. So maybe this is the time to emphasize the opportunity to learn collaboration, self-reflection, resiliency, right? Innovation, where you don't need access to the big machines if the sanitary conditions are such that it is unsafe, just not allowed to have access to the machines. I guess that's what the question referred to. And I have time perhaps for one last question now.
Okay, as a follow-up to that, would a greater level of public scientific literacy assist in addressing many of these current educational challenges? And as you answer that, could you advise us as to what decisions educational planners in the Caribbean region may make today that will help us to shape a future in a better way so we can build back better?
Well, it would be pretentious of me to suggest what decisions planners in the Caribbean should make, because I'm not doing work in the Caribbean. I think that's an answer that the University of West Indies is best positioned to answer than I would be. But I certainly agree with the premise of the question, which is that this moment underscores the urgency of teaching the mindset of a scientist, not fundamentally to teach knowledge, but to teach people to think the way scientists do, to have respect for evidence, to have respect for the methods that can help us come up with truths that are, like any scientific truth, provisional, but not the kind of alternative truth that some demagogues might say, you know, this pandemic is a figment of somebody's imagination, and if we could just wish it away, it would go away. And I do think that there is a good, solid body of knowledge of how to do that. I think that project and problem-based education are a very good way to help students learn how to do that. I have developed 3 curricula. Professor Canute had access to them that provide a complete itinerary from kindergarten to the end of high school that are aligned with the kinds of skills that can help us achieve the SDGs. So I think, and those curricula have been used, and they're open resources, so you can access them. They're examples. They're all referenced in this book that I have mentioned, which is an open book, so you can easily find it, Educating Students to Improve the World. You will, in that curriculum, in that book, have access to my world course, and to my 60 lessons curriculum. And I offer those simply as examples, as prototypes of what educators in the Caribbean could develop. So if I had any advice to offer to educational planners, it would be work closely with your teachers, work hand in hand with the teachers, and help them develop a real map, a real itinerary that tells them, what do I need to do differently on Monday morning? And to me, that would be engage your students in problem-based, project-based activities that help them gradually build the breadth of competencies that would help them build about a world without poverty, a world with gender equality, a world without hunger. I believe this is possible. There are schools around the world doing it, and I'm certain that there are schools already doing this in the Caribbean. And maybe the task for planners is to identify a few of them, learn from them, and then try to spread those practices and combine that knowledge from where the system is with knowledge from what other systems are doing to then help build a path. If I could just conclude, maybe this would be an answer to your question. Let me share my screen again, because there are a few resources there that I suspect are going to be valuable. Let me just see if I can do this now. Not sure I'm going to succeed. Can you see my screen at the moment?
Yes, we can, Professor.
Okay, I'm going to very quickly just take you to a quick summary, because I think that here it is. A quick summary of what I do in the Global Education Innovation Initiative, which is this effort run out of a university to try to be of service to society. And it's basically built on my theory of informed dialogue. This is our last book, actually, on climate change. It's another open education resource. So what we do in the initiative are three interrelated set of activities. Number one, we conduct applied research. We conduct studies that directly answer questions of interest to decision makers. And these are the 8 studies, the 8 books we have published so far. These are all open access books. You can find them online. But we also develop tools that are based on this informed dialogue. So, for example, one of the things I did is I put together ministers, like these ministers of education of Sao Paulo, of Bogota, who were doing exemplary things, and I invited them to reflect on the leadership challenges this pandemic had caused for them. And I basically analyzed that and produced this little book. It's only available in Spanish, Leading Education Systems During the Pandemic. A number of people who have told me this is extremely useful as a leadership framework to lead during the pandemic. The other book here, Leading Education Through COVID-19, is a result of a similar exercise with 50 educators around the world who are doing what they can to sustain education, reflecting on the leadership challenges this pandemic has caused for them. I'm at the moment conducting a similar study with education entrepreneurs in 30 different jurisdictions, similar questions. So, and then the last thing, these are the tools that I was referencing. These curriculum resources, these roadmaps aligned with the SDGs and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These are all resources. I will be sending to Professor Canut a list of all these resources in the hope that he can make them available to those of you participating in the meeting. These are just some examples of the kinds of things. But I guess my advice to education planners would be more about what not to do than about what to do. What I have seen is actually very harmful leadership in this context, is arrogant leadership, is the leadership that pretends that you know the answers to a problem that none of us understands very well, is the leadership that prevents people from collaborating, is the leadership that says, get out of the way because I will solve that problem. There are places that have adopted that leadership, including in this country, the United States. And for the most part, I think that that leadership has caused harm. Just like deficient leadership has caused more people to die than would have been necessary, that kind of leadership in education is going to cause the death of the minds and of the educational opportunities of students. So I would invite educational planners and decision makers in the Caribbean to exercise humble leadership, servant leadership, vulnerable leadership, leadership that invites collaborations with other colleagues, the leadership that has the courage to say, I don't have all the answers to how we're going to solve these, but I have the confidence that together we are going to be able to walk this difficult moment together much better than if any of us pretends that we're in charge. Thank you very much.
Thank you too, Professor.
And on that note, I'm going to have to beg your leave. And I thank you very much for this opportunity. And I thank you all for your leadership. Thank you very much. Bye.
Good morning again, everyone. I'm Maxine Henry Wilson, and I'll be facilitating the next few sessions because Prof. Thompson had to take on another assignment. He may be back, but in the interim. So we thank Professor Ramirez for his very insightful and comprehensive presentation. And those who ask questions, I'm sure there'll be an opportunity for you to get some answers to other questions. We're now at the stage where we're going to be doing two sets of reflections and applications, one by Ms. Diane Bailey, who is a student success practitioner and educator and a member of the CCEP team, operations team, and the other is by Dr. Paulette Henry, who is the Director of Center of Excellence for Teaching and Learning at the University of Guyana. We're going to ask them to proceed one after the other. I'll not be intervening. So now over to you, Ms. Bailey.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to share with you this morning as we talk about reimagining education, present and post-COVID-19 considerations. I'll not be sharing a slideshow presentation this morning. I will be looking at a review of a chapter in the book by Professor Ramirez, Implementing Deeper Learning and 21st Century Education Reforms, Building an Education Renaissance After a Global Pandemic. Now, I'll be focusing on chapter 1, specifically section 1.2. Chapter 1 is titled, In Search of a 21st Century Education Renaissance After a Global Pandemic, and section 1.2, How Should We Educate Our Children? Now, the pandemic has disrupted educational systems across the world, and it has also forced us to utilize remote teaching and learning to ensure educational continuity, learning, and engagement. This has been done through, but not limited to, digital platforms, radio, and even television. However, despite this effort to ensure that we're able to continue the business of education, there are numerous limitations that must be explored in the present and future. Now, with the limitations that exist, this question of how our students or children should be educated or what should be offered to them is also of great importance. Is it that we are to just focus on the foundational literacies that include numeracy, reading and writing, or should we offer our students a broader set of knowledge and skills? Now, the findings from this chapter indicate that it is the universal right of every child to be educated. This was not the norm back in 1918 when we had the Spanish flu pandemic. At that time, we had about 39% participation in education, while today we have over 80%. However, despite the increased participation, there are limited commonalities on how this should be done due to differences in schools across the globe, right? This happens within countries such as our very own country here in Jamaica, and also countries across the region, and as I would have shared earlier, across the globe. Now, lack of institutional capacity of governments to support all schools remain an issue. And as we grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic, as I shared earlier, is it that we should focus on just our foundational literacies or a broader set of skills? Now, while a broad education is very vital, funding determines whether or not we can offer either of the two or even both to our students. Some of the insights include how we educate our children. It was shared that it is dependent on the intersection of institutional capacity, which is the ability of the institution to set and achieve its goals, how we develop educational goals that ensure inclusivity, equal opportunities, and access to a broad range of knowledge and skills. And lastly, the intersection includes resources, to include physical, financial, and human resources. The truth is that if we are to focus on offering just basic skills to our students during this pandemic, it is going to limit the opportunities that our students will have. And if we focus on an expanded range of skills, that will ensure full economic and civic participation, which in turn will facilitate sustainable development. This is particularly important to me as a higher education specialist, as students cannot participate in higher education without having this kind of skill set. In the book, Professor Ramirez shared about a study in Massachusetts in the United States of America. It highlights the fact that despite educational attainment increasing, there are still gaps as it relates to access to higher education and also retention, meaning completion of degree programs. And this happens between racial groups, the gaps, and across socioeconomic status. This results in limited opportunities, right? So when we focus on not providing an expanded skill set to our students, they're going to get less access to college guidance and support, less emphasis on things like critical thinking, academic and social skills that are necessary for participation in higher education. Now, how can we use this information to assist the Jamaican and Caribbean education setting? The first thing we must look into is that a good foundational education is what will increase access to the different levels of the education system, and ultimately higher education. And across the region, we have a goal where we want to increase access to tertiary education, and so this becomes very critical. However, we can't skip the different steps, and so the foundation is very, very important. It therefore means that governments need to devise a suitable funding model to ensure equity across all schools, to focus on expanded skill set for everyone, and also to put the necessary technological infrastructure in place across all schools. It can't be a situation where some schools have the technology and some don't, or some are located in areas where they have access while others don't. Another important thing is that effective planning needs to be done and policies developed that will support the purpose of education. Or administrators, teachers, and facilitators that provide learning inside and outside of the classroom must understand the purpose of education. They must also share the vision, a part of bringing out change or having a renaissance is that there must be a shared vision of full educational achievement for all students in order for us to be a success. Our students must have access to the technological resources that will be required. And I want to bring out the point that technology should be a standard for all educational systems, whether or not we're dealing with a pandemic. And so access to devices, internet connectivity, data, Wi-Fi, all of those things are of utmost importance. And further to that, mandatory participation in education is a must. Currently, there are many students that are being left behind because even though we have decided, particularly in the Jamaican setting, to do remote teaching and learning, there are many students who are still not able to access their classes online. So technology should be a part of all educational systems, and it should be a standard both now and in the future. Finally, research plays a critical role to inform our practice. You know, publications such as what Professor Ramirez would have, written, aid in the development of policies and make available best practices to stakeholders that have responsibility for delivery. It also limits our assumptions, and that is why it is important for us to conduct research so that it can inform our practice. These things will inevitably allow us to develop an educational renaissance during and after the COVID-19 pandemic that will help our children or students to function up in society and be successful and active citizens. And I just want to share with you that expanding the goals of education is highlighted in the United Nations Developmental Goal for Education. Goal 4, section 4.7 states that by 2030, we should ensure that all learners are able to acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. This should serve as a framework to ensure that we have a common goal as it relates to what we should be teaching our children. So thank you very much for having me, and I encourage you to further engage with this book. It is actually available online for free. As I said, the chapter I focused on is In Search of a 21st Century Education Renaissance After a Global Pandemic. And the title of the book is Implementing Deeper Learning and 21st Education Reforms. Thank you very much.
Good morning, colleagues. I am Paulette Henry from Guyana, and I'm pleased to be a part of this discussion as we look at the theme, Reimagining Education Pre- and Post-COVID-19 Considerations. Please permit me to share my screen. Give me 1 second, please. Thank you. I strongly support the position taken by Christine Gregor, who says that education is the foundation upon which we build our future. Hence, our having this conversation at this time to look at pre-COVID and the post-COVID and where we're going is so important for us as a Caribbean people. To tell you a little bit about what obtained in Guyana in the pre-COVID-19, our different layers of education had been predominantly free
except for the university education. And even with the university education, the government took the bulk of that cost with them funding about 60% of the education budget, and the finance from students was just about 30%, with the other levels being given through fundraising activities and the like. That being said, our pre-COVID experience would show that we've been largely consistent in receiving about 16% of the budget allocations going towards education. And that has been relatively stable from 2015 to 2020. If you look right at the side of that, I'm showing you what our university got. And the university funds has been low, continues to be not what we would like it to be. But again, with between 2015 2020, we saw some stability and a kind of 4% increase. You would know, those of you who are in education and in the financial aspect of education would know that it's not enough, but there's been a resistance to increase in fees and the like. So we are grappling with a lot of our areas of funding, and not only for the university, for the education sector particularly. The funding towards this sector has been low, as other priorities sometimes take precedence. Our teacher education in Guyana is funded largely, or offered, I should say, largely through the Cyril Potter College of Education. And for those of you who in the region may be familiar with the terrain of Guyana, you will notice that we have Guyana is 3,000 square miles. Our education is largely centralized for the higher education offerings, and for teacher education, it's on the coast. We have about 6 centers along the different geographic locations, but the areas that are underserved are the hinterland areas, largely where the Amerindian communities are located. Notwithstanding, a lot of effort has been made in recent times to plug some resources in the hinterland training, and we saw a lot of that happening in the post-COVID period, which I'm going to stress on a little bit later. But to say that education, teacher education, university education, they have largely been centered on the coast, and persons from the hinterland and from rural communities find it difficult often to access. And to access education on the coast, they do so at great sacrifice. Now, when we look at what happened since March 2020, early in this year, the issues have been raised, and as Professor Ramirez said, those are the things that we have now come to know. The lack of access in many instances. We saw the disparity in those between the haves and the have-nots. We saw the challenges in terms of how resources were managed. We saw our deficiencies in human capital. For us too, we had issues as it related to the infrastructure, and issues as it relates to student and teacher well-being. Just to highlight some of those issues that we experienced, I wanted to share with you that some of the information gathered is that because of the lack of access, you saw low student participation and in classes at every level in the school system, because school was out, and persons did not all have access to the material, to the technology. And then when you did have access, we also had infrastructural challenges, because we sometimes suffer from the power outages. So that disrupted the teaching and learning environment. We had some persons, because of their income and finances, they did not have the resources to purchase data. But what we did see as a result of that is group study where people were sharing in communities their resources so that students and children can come together in groups and study. But as it relates to the teaching capacity to teach and deliver online, that proved a challenge again. And we also heard issues of teacher burnout. You had issues of teacher experience where they too had to grapple with when they had to return to school or to be at home. So there was the different issues as it relates to teachers and their own responsibilities, their own personal responsibilities, even as they were expected to deliver the online component of the teaching and learning experience for children. Parenting, I heard Professor Remus talk about that, and yes, there have been highs and lows when you talk to teachers, and this is not from any documented information that I have, but just conversations that have been had with parents as teachers and with parents themselves who were grappling to support their children whilst they were home from school, and school was not offered in the structured and traditional ways that we were accustomed to. So the issues of student well-being, parent well-being, and teacher well-being, those are some of the challenges that are very important for us. But one of the things that I want to emphasize too that must be made mention of is the responsiveness of government, and we've had a change of government in Guyana within months. But what you have seen is the building on some of the work that started before COVID-19. For example, for the hinterland communities, there are radio station and expansion of the television and learning channel in 6 different communities. The University of Guyana even got involved in projects which saw the reporting of information to students in their language, which made it more relevant and for them and their learning. What we also saw the government currently continues to do is mass teacher training to build their capacity for online delivery. This is not something that we had envisaged, but it's also a really good thing for Guyana, particularly with the terrain, as persons are now given that capacity and we see that we can teach and learn differently. There is now simultaneous teachers training, so teaching the teacher colleges to maximize resources and all of that. They are offering teaching at the same times across the country, and that's a good thing. We've had persons who have not yet gone to the teachers training college, or but are still in the teaching system, benefiting from particular skill set to enhance their ability to deliver teaching in the hinterland communities. And those are things that really are helpful. The government is working across the country to make sure that internet hubs that were in place earlier, that they are sustained. And even private education institutions are also benefiting from opportunities to upskill their staff. So different initiatives are happening across the country in teacher education to make sure that our teachers and those involved in education have the capacity to continue to deliver efficiently and effectively online. I must say as well that all of these initiatives are offered with support of some international partners. And we have, whilst I've cited UNICEF here, we also have the OAS that has been a good partner in teacher education and in the expansion project. So, but specifically UNICEF has been funding the COVID-19 accelerated program, and within that program, there are special packages of resources for teachers and for students to make sure that they can benefit from the online learning experiences. UNICEF is also looking at assessing learning loss, and that is something that would help in terms of policy and the planning, so that we know the gaps in the learning and what could be done to assist. As I mentioned earlier, the well-being of students is of critical concern, and this is something that has been addressed in collaboration with other sectors. So the Child Protection Agency particularly has been focusing on that, and there has been an increase in education, increase of messaging to help us to understand what is happening and what some of the challenges are and what to look for. What we have seen too is an upsurge in some instances of domestic violence and murder, suicide, and the like. So those are things that we have to keep our eye on and play a role in terms of how it affects our learning communities. Now, I am located at the University of Guyana, and I must say that I think one of our big successes in terms of managing this process has stemmed from the leadership. We've had a new vice chancellor, a new leadership team at the university community, and I think very early they recognized that this pandemic is not something that any one person could definitely address, and we have seen the upsurge of a strengthening, I should say, rather than an upsurge, a strengthening of the different communities and management committees across the university in terms of the response and the approach to addressing how we lead as a higher education institution. So we've had the university leadership look at the staff inside of it, and that is the teaching and non-teaching staff, as well as the student side, and what can be done to support our students. And I think we have been doing fairly well in terms of how the leadership has been responding to the issues. So staff and their material needs in terms of laptops, and the retraining of staff, the policies to support what we are now doing in this new environment, those are things that we have seen come on board. We have, I heard the question being posed to Professor Reams in terms of what is happening to teach certain courses and certain programs differently. And we've seen creativity and innovation in terms of the teaching and learning environment as lecturers are taught through different means how to do simulation activities to deliver teacher education, for example, to do labs, for example, you know. So there are a lot of new learnings that have shifted and moved into place because of this pandemic, and I see that as a positive, one of the positives for the university. Our university leadership has also been able to foster some partnerships with the Commonwealth of Learning, CARICOM, UE as well. We've also seen partnerships stemming between the university and the internet providers in Guyana. We have put in place stronger infrastructure in terms of support systems for student engagement, for student advisement, for teacher support, and you know, those are things that have continued to help us and help us well. So as I wrap up, I wanted to say to you that I think our key successes as it relates to the human capital is definitely a shared and accessible leadership, continued professional development and staff online processes, the new hiring processes, with us being borderless now, you're getting an opportunity to hire lecturers across the globe, and they bring with them different skills, innovations, creativity, but the I think the hallmark of what is happening now is that we have to keep talking, we have to keep communicating, we have to find ways of continuing to support our student population and to support our colleagues in the education sector. So I want to close on this note, but to say to you that emergency education still remains an uncharted territory. And the more we talk to each other, the more we converse with each other, I think the better we'll be able to manage this pandemic and the challenges that it poses. I see more opportunities lying ahead for us. Thank you.
Thanks to both. Thanks to both Paulette Henry and Dan Bailey for those insightful observations and input and their input. Now I'm going to ask Ms. Nadine Davis, who is a part of the team, a very central part of the team at CCEP and in the School of Education, to take your questions and we'll ask both to try and provide answers. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you, Ms. Bailey. Thank you, Dr. Henry, for the insightful presentations and reflections. I am going to do the questions according to person, Ms. Bailey. That was an excellent analysis and review of the book, and I must say that both presentations, they are in line and speaking with the timeliness, as everyone would say, of the webinar at this time and our dealing with the COVID pandemic. Ms. Bailey, this question is for you. The Sustainable Development Goal 4 speaks to quality education, but with the current pandemic, it has exposed the inequalities that exist. Do you now think that, or how do we treat with this now to ensure that each student is given quality education? Ms. Bailey? Oh, well, let me, Dr. Henry, let me go to your section. Now, Dr. Henry, you have identified the digital divide and have also spoken to the access to education. Now with the pandemic, how do we help teachers? You spoke about the well-being of teachers and students. How do you propose that we help them now to advance to this new stage of the to this deficit, to eliminate or mitigate this deficit of the digital divide?
Thank you. I think the education system now has to be looking in terms of retraining of our teachers as well as having a support system. So it's going to be a two-pronged approach. One, where we look to see what teachers are doing differently that they were not doing before and how we can best support them in their delivery. So we definitely have to upskill them. And the education systems, I think, in my country and from what I've heard around the globe, we have been trying our very best to do so. But on the other hand, in terms of their personal well-being as well, I think teachers, like everyone else that are grappling with the fear and everything that stems from COVID-19, there definitely needs to be some system for counsel and support for their mental well-being as well, because they cannot be efficient and effective if they are not mentally and otherwise strong.
Thank you for that, Dr. Henry. That has been proposed by many, such as yourself, about the focus on counseling and intervention to treat with the psychological and resocialization of these students and teachers. Now, I go towards looking at the collaboration that you mentioned in your country, at your university, which is also looked at as an international imperative based on the UN. And I must say that I am happy to know that you have the collaboration and the collaboration with the partners toward this interest. But the UN said they are looking at something to save our children. And how do you think that, what is in place to treat with children who learn at a face-to-face environment as well as those with learning disabilities?
And that's something that I think will definitely require a stakeholder conversation, a wider stakeholder conversation with the persons who are best, the technical experts in this area. We cannot plan in isolation of those groups, and so it would require a conversation to understand what their needs are, what the issues are, what the challenges are. I know just recently we've had a student at UG where we have been teaching online, and some issues were pointed out, and we've had to be very responsive, and so academic advisement is now an important aspect of the delivery. Maybe our schools will require more social support in terms of social workers and counselors across the region, in our countries and across the region, to help. But definitely it's not something that we can just place at the feet of the teacher alone or at the ministry. It has to be an interagency collaboration with consultation.
Thank you for that, Dr. Henry. Definitely collaboration is needed, particularly as you mentioned finance, and finance is one of my major areas. It is also been said that the UN is also looking at leaving no one behind, leaving no student behind, ensuring that each student is included. What are the financial strategies that are being implemented with the collaborations to get this to move forward?
We will definitely have to seek aggressively international collaborations where possible to support our children. And even in terms of higher education, we will definitely need more financing. Currently, our budget, and it is said that the budgets of other Caribbean countries are below the 20% of the education sector gets less, in most instances, less than 20% of the budget. It is suggested by the Jomtien 2011 statement in the education sector report that we should have at least 20% or 6%, 20% of the budget or 6% of the GDP. That has not been happening. To fill that deficit, we need to work with our partners. To fill the financial deficit, we'll definitely need to work with our partners. We'll definitely need to increase fundraising. We have to see how we can get a culture in the region where we'll get our alumni and others to be given more, but we definitely need more monies that we are getting, more investments in education if we are to collectively grapple with the COVID-19 and all the things that are happening around it.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Henry, for that insightful and excellent response. I would like to invite Diane Bailey, if she is online still, unless she has diverted to another seminar. But she mentioned in her presentation about the access to education, which is very important and which is needed for the blended modality in this new pandemic. And I must say that we would need to, as an international community, to ensure that this is incorporated for COVID-19 and beyond. Thank you, Ms. Bailey. Thank you, Dr. Henry.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, everyone, and those were two very important inclusions of our practitioners. Thank you very much. I've been tasked with just briefly wrapping up the session. I think what we've really had today is a conversation, very important conversation. As I was entering the building, I heard someone saying, "How do you spell so-and-so?" It was always the voice of a father. So I turned around, and when I looked, I saw under the gazebo two students, one with a KC tie, that's a Jamaican reference, and a little one. The one with the KC tie had his tablet. He was fully dressed for school, and he was sitting with his tablet, obviously, teaching and learning activity. Little girl had no tablet. She was fully dressed for school, but her father was insistent that she had to do schoolwork. So he was giving her words to spell, and she was spelling them, and then he would say, "Write them down." And I contrasted that with my personal situation with my grandson. I left him at home. He was in a dedicated space with a very up-to-date laptop, full Wi-Fi, and somebody supervising him. And at first I said, this really represents the disparities. But then I said, it also represents resilience. And it is the question that Prof. Rima asked, what are we going to do against the odds? To me, that seems to be the sort of summary statement about our dialogue here today. Prof. Hall put it in a kind of global context where he said that globalization did not mean this to us at the beginning, but now it means that our lives have been disrupted, and we would never have imagined probably 9-10 months ago that we would be in this situation. And it has thrown, of course, great challenges to the education system, but to families as a whole. Prof. Rima's contribution really then now demonstrated how we have been able to fight this COVID and determined lots of persons, the principals, the educators, as he said, the circumstances of their involvement are almost phenomenal. I suppose some of us were a little shaken by his use of the 1980s Spanish epidemic and what he said was the emergence of the Weimar Republic. And I suppose what he was doing was cautioning us to be alert, cautioning us to recognize that where we see opportunity, there may also others who see the opportunity in another way. So it was very important for him to align what he was saying to goal number 4.7 and to of the Sustainable Development Goals and Article 26 of the Declaration of Human Rights. And I think the salient point there is the continued centrality of education. The importance of education, as he said, not just in terms of the basic skills, but in drawing on the analogy of 1918, he also warned us about the importance of teaching our children to be analytical and to be critical. What he said is that there are those who still continue to be captured by demagogues. And therefore, the skills that we have to teach our children, and this was really reinforced by Diane Bailey in her presentation, the skills are not just about the basic literacy. It is about discernment. It is about an appreciation of your environment. It is about resilience. Professor Rimmer also tried to do a crafting of the world after the epidemic. And he pointed out, as we all seem now realize, that the crisis is not just about the epidemic. It's not just about education, but that we now have multiple crises. Some of them coming from what existed before the 2008 economic crisis. And we have to really now think seriously about the fact, as he said, that the estimate is that 120 million families are now faced with extreme poverty. Probably on a daily basis we can see it. I have been noting that there are far more homeless people on the road with their all of their belongings, right? All of their belongings. So we then come to the point of the future. We are very aware of the present, but for the future to be carved, there are some indisputable requirements. One of them I thought, and again it was mentioned by Dr. Henry, is the whole question of the university, not just as an academy of learning, but as an academy of practice. And he pointed out that we have to now move beyond our traditional skills, our traditional roles. And the question that I thought was important that he asked, he said at the end of it, every member of the academy has to be able to say, we did everything in our power. We did everything in our power. We're not going to be able to do everything, as he says, but we have to ask the question. We have to be satisfied that we did everything in our power. So his seven dividends of the pandemic, the 7 dividends of the pandemic that he sort of asks us to look at in terms of going forward. And again, both Dan, Ms. Bailey, and Dr. Henry mentioned one that I think we're probably losing a little bit of a focus on, educating the whole child. We are still talking about covering the syllabus. Very important, of course, but children cannot learn while in fear. That is what is reaffirmed by all the presentations, that children learn differently. How do we ensure that we are not just putting everybody in a box and saying you have to learn by what is really sometimes a kind of didactic that it's just so linear that the students, as one little, there was a video that was circulating with a little girl protesting vehemently the fact that she had to be sitting in front of this computer. And her mother said to her, but every time you answer a question, the teacher says, good job, good job. She says, I want to stop doing a good job. I want to go to school and see my friends. I think there is that issue of the children and how they're being socialized. And the other aspect, which all three covered, was our collaborative approach that we have to take. Leaders have to understand that they do not have all the answers. And this is leaders at all levels. What we have seen coming out of this, what we could say is a disruption, and again mentioned by all the presenters, is the level of innovation in the classroom, here meaning in education. I think we ourselves have seen instances where teachers are so dedicated that they get a bike man or they get a bike and they go and they deliver the lessons themselves. We have seen instances where teachers become community leaders, putting up community boards. What I want to ensure is that at the end of it, this is not the end of the innovation, but also that we distill these lessons that we have learned and that they become a part of how we prepare our future teachers and the kinds of, as was said by Dr. Henry, the kinds of professional development that we do with our teachers, that we don't just focus on the pedagogy, but we see them as persons with ideas, and that our literature and our research will reflect that we have had our homegrown innovation in terms of the response to this crisis, and that is recorded. What particularly impressed me in the presentations was the similarities of the issues that confront us. Whether it was in Guyana or it was in Colombia, we still had those issues of just delivery, of content, of professionals who are involved and who are trying to ensure that they do everything in their power to make sure that our children do not suffer through too much of a drastic learning loss, but equally as important, the psychosocial negative impact that this whole experience could have on them. So it is in this context that I underline what Prof. Hall said at the beginning. If the CCEP did not exist, it would have to be created. It is a time when education planning, but also education learning is very important. And the leadership role of the CCEP is once again underlined by this very important webinar on reimagining education pre and post COVID-19 considerations. We're not yet post COVID-19. The Minister of Health here says that by the end of next year, probably only about 16% of our people may have the vaccine. So this is likely to go on for some time. And the CCEP has to be ready, willing, and able to carry forward this conversation at each point, ensuring that we add some value. Thank everyone for your involvement, and it was really a very stimulating conversation.
Mrs. Maxine Henry Wilson, former Minister of Education here in Jamaica and active member of the CCEP operations team. I would tell a little bit of story. Professor Hall, Kenneth Hall, former principal here, served as principal of this campus for several years. As I indicated earlier, he's now the chair of the CCEP's advisory board. And in briefing him earlier this week, one of his first questions was, do you have Maxine Henry Wilson on your team? So I want to affirm the wisdom, the vast experience of our colleague, Mrs. Henry Wilson, and to convey to everyone who has participated in this webinar, Dr. Henry from Guyana, Ms. Bailey, this student success officer, manager at Western Campus, Professor Ramirez, Prof. Hall, our technical people, and above all of you who have joined us across the world. We are grateful that you took the time to participate in this event. We believe, as has been said, that there is a critical role for us as a planning entity, a critical role for us to play in supporting the work of institutions and countries. And on behalf of the hardworking team at the CCEP, which includes colleagues who you have not seen today and others whom you have seen, I want to commit on their behalf our commitment to supporting the work of the CCEP, the work of our countries. The colleagues on whose wisdom, experience, and skill we draw are from different countries of the Caribbean, different campuses of the University of the West Indies, and we want to affirm our partnership role and our partnership commitment. Once again, to thank you. And I have provided for those whose addresses I had immediately, the links to the various resources that Professor Ramirez mentioned. But if you wish to have those resources, you could simply send us an email at ccep.uwimona.edu.jm. Send us an email at that address and we'll forward the link to you of the various resources. Thank you very much and have a great day.